The communication array on Zephyr Prime crackled with dying energy as Ambassador Kellen pressed her trembling hands against the control panel. Around her, the capital city burned. The acrid smoke of destroyed buildings mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp ozone smell of energy weapons. Through the shattered windows of the embassy, she could see the Vorthan war machines rolling through the streets, their massive treads crushing everything in their path. "Please," she whispered into the transmitter, her voice breaking. "This is Ambassador Kellen of the Zephyrian Republic, transmitting on emergency frequency 77 Alpha. We need immediate assistance. The Vorthan Empire has launched a full-scale invasion of our homeworld. They're killing civilians. They're bombing hospitals and schools. Please, someone help us." The building shook as another explosion rocked the district. Kellen fell to her knees, but kept her hands on the controls. She had to keep trying. The Galactic Council's response teams were probably days away, if they came at all. The Zephyrians were a small species, barely 15 million souls on their single world. They had nothing to offer the greater galactic community except their famous crystal gardens and their peaceful nature. No one would start a war to save them. "This is Emergency Beacon 77 Alpha," she continued, tears streaming down her blue-scaled face. "Zephyr Prime is under attack. The Vorthans have broken the galactic accords. They're using illegal bioweapons on our people. Our defense grid is down. Our fleet is destroyed. We have maybe 6 hours before they break through to the underground shelters where we've moved the children." Another blast, closer this time. The lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, Kellen could hear the distant screams of her people and the grinding mechanical sounds of the Vorthan army advancing through the city. She fumbled for the emergency power switch and managed to restore partial power to the communications array. "If anyone can hear this," she said, her voice stronger now, filled with the desperate courage of someone who has nothing left to lose, "please remember us. Remember that we tried to live in peace. Remember that we never hurt anyone. Remember that we asked for help, and tell our story to the stars." The signal traveled outward from Zephyr Prime, racing through the quantum communication network that connected the civilized worlds of the galaxy. It bounced off relay stations and passed through dozens of monitoring posts, carrying its message of desperation across light years of space. On Alturia Prime, the gentle, white-furred Altruians received the signal and immediately began organizing a relief mission. Their small fleet of medical ships and diplomatic vessels would take 3 days to reach Zephyr Prime, but they would come. They always did. On Centauri Station, the Multispecies Galactic Council Emergency Committee received the transmission and began their standard protocols. Forms were filed, committees were formed, and debates began about jurisdiction and proper response procedures. By their calculations, they could have a formal response ready within a standard week. But the signal didn't stop there. It continued its journey through space, following communication channels that hadn't been updated in decades. Old relay stations, forgotten monitoring posts, and abandoned communication arrays all dutifully passed along the message. Finally, 27 hours after Ambassador Kellen sent her desperate plea, it reached a small monitoring station on the edge of human space. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was pulling the graveyard shift at Outpost Whiskey 7, a tiny listening post that most people had forgotten existed. She was nursing her third cup of coffee and working her way through a crossword puzzle when the emergency beacon activated. The sudden noise startled her so badly that she spilled hot coffee all over her uniform. "What the hell?" she muttered, rushing to the console. Emergency signals were rare out here on the frontier. Most of the time, it was just merchant ships having engine trouble or explorers who had gotten lost in uncharted space. But, as she listened to Ambassador Kellen's message, her expression grew serious. "Zephyrian Republic," she said to herself, running the name through her database. "Never heard of them. But they're calling for help against something called the Vorthan Empire." She frowned as she read through the limited information her computer could provide. Bioweapons. Targeting civilians. Bombing hospitals. Sarah had served 2 tours in the Centauri border wars before accepting this quiet posting. She had seen what happened when the bad guys decided that the rules didn't apply to them. The thought of children hiding in underground shelters while monsters dropped poison from the sky made her stomach turn. She looked at her communication panel. Technically, she was supposed to forward any emergency signals to Sector Command and let them handle it. But Sector Command was 3 days away, and, by the sound of it, these Zephyrians didn't have 3 days. Hell, they might not have 3 hours. Screw protocol, she said, and opened a direct channel to the nearest military installation. The call was answered by Commander Jackson Phillips, commanding officer of the UES Relentless, a heavy cruiser that was currently docked at Kepler Station for routine maintenance. Phillips was a veteran of 30 years in the Human Defense Force, a big man with gray hair and scars on his hands from a dozen different battles. "What can I do for you, Whiskey 7, he asked, recognizing the call sign. "Commander, I've got an emergency signal from outside human space," Sarah said quickly. "Small civilization called the Zephyrian Republic is under attack by something called the Vorthan Empire. They're bombing civilians, using bioweapons, targeting hospitals and schools. The whole planet is going down, and they've got kids in the shelters." Phillips was quiet for a moment. "How long ago was this signal sent?" 27 hours ago. "Sir, by their timeline, those shelters might already be compromised." "Send me everything you have," Phillips ordered. "Signal logs, star charts, whatever intelligence we've got on both species. I'll get back to you in 10 minutes. Sarah worked quickly, compiling every scrap of information she could find. The Zephyrians appeared to be a peaceful species, focused on art and agriculture. No military to speak of, no advanced weapons technology, no strategic resources that would make them a threat to anyone. The Vorthans, on the other hand, were listed as a known aggressive species with a history of expansion through conquest. They had been quiet for the last 50 years, leading the Galactic Council to believe they had reformed. Apparently, that had been wishful thinking. True to his word, Phillips called back in exactly 10 minutes. "Lieutenant, I need you to patch me through to Fleet Command immediately. Priority Alpha." "And, Sarah?" "Yes, sir?" "Good catch. If we move fast, we might be able to save some of those people." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with worry. She had done the right thing, but she also knew what it meant when the Human Defense Force decided to move fast. Humanity had a reputation in the galaxy, and it wasn't for being gentle. Within an hour, the call had reached Admiral Catherine Morrison at Fleet Command on Luna. Morrison was known throughout human space as the Iron Lady, a woman who had never lost a battle and never backed down from a fight. She listened to the recording of Ambassador Kellen's plea 3 times before making her decision. "Signal the Third Fleet," she ordered. "Battle stations. We launch in 12 hours. "Ma'am," her aide said carefully, "the Zephyrians aren't human citizens. We have no treaty obligations to them. The Galactic Council might object to unauthorized military action in their space." Morrison fixed him with a stare that could cut through armor plating. "Son, I've been fighting wars since before you were born, and I've learned one thing that's never failed me. When someone is bombing children, you don't stop to read the fine print. You stop them. Period." "Yes, ma'am." "What should I tell the Galactic Council if they ask about our intentions?" "Tell them we got a distress call, and we're responding. If they have a problem with that, they can file a complaint after we're done." As the aide hurried away to carry out her orders, Morrison stood at her office window, looking out at the ships of the Third Fleet. She thought about Ambassador Kellen, alone in a burning city, pleading for help that might never come. She thought about children hiding in underground shelters while monsters prowled above. And she thought about humanity's long journey from a small blue planet to the stars, and how they had never forgotten what it felt like to be helpless. The Third Fleet was the pride of the Human Defense Force. 15 heavy cruisers, 20 destroyers, 8 carriers, and the flagship UES Retribution, a massive dreadnought that could crack a moon in half. It had been designed to fight wars against peer opponents, not to police the galaxy. But, sometimes, Morrison reflected, that was exactly what you needed. By the time the Galactic Council's Emergency Committee finished their preliminary discussions about the Zephyrian situation, the Third Fleet was already halfway to Zephyr Prime, moving through hyperspace at speeds that made the other galactic civilizations nervous. The Altrian Relief Fleet, still 2 days out, received a priority communication from Earth. "This is Admiral Morrison of the Human Defense Force," the message said. "We are responding to the Zephyrian distress call. Maintain your current course and prepare to provide humanitarian assistance. We'll handle the military situation." The Altrian commander, a gentle soul named Healer Velith, listened to the message with growing concern. Humanity was not known for subtle responses to military threats. Their idea of handling a military situation often left large portions of star systems uninhabitable. Send a message to the Galactic Council, Velith ordered. Tell them the humans are coming. Back on Zephyr Prime, Ambassador Kellen had long since abandoned the embassy. The building had taken a direct hit from a Vorthan plasma cannon, and most of the diplomatic quarter was now rubble. She was with the other survivors in Underground Complex 7, one of the last functioning shelters. The power was failing, the air recyclers were struggling, and food was running low. Above them, they could hear the sounds of Vorthan troops moving through the city, systematically clearing out the last pockets of resistance. How long until they find us? Asked Dr. Yef, the shelter's medical officer. His scales had turned pale with fear and exhaustion. Maybe 6 hours, Kellen replied. Maybe less. The upper levels are already compromised. They're working their way down. Around them, 300 Zephyrian civilians sat in small groups, holding their children and speaking in whispers. Many of them looked to Kellen for guidance, but she had no more answers. Her people were artists and farmers, not warriors. They had never hurt anyone, never threatened anyone, never done anything except try to live in peace. And now they were going to die for it. Ambassador, called a voice from across the shelter. It was Technician Rels, a young Zephyrian who had been trying to maintain their remaining communication equipment. I'm picking up something strange on the long-range sensors. Kellen hurried over to his station. What kind of strange? Multiple contacts, approaching from galactic north. Big ones. Moving very fast. Rels looked up at her with confusion in his large, dark eyes. Ambassador, these readings don't match any known Galactic Council ships. Could it be more Vorthans? No, ma'am. These ships are larger than anything in the Vorthan fleet. And they're not using Vorthan transponder codes. Actually, he paused, checking his readings again, they're not using any transponder codes I recognize. Above them, a new sound echoed through the shelter. The rumbling of the Vorthan war machines had stopped. In its place was something else. A deep, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from the sky itself. Kellen looked up at the ceiling, hope and fear warring in her chest. How long until those unknown contacts reach orbit? Rels checked his instruments. They're already here. High Admiral Kresh of the Vorthan Empire stood on the bridge of his flagship, the dominant predator, and surveyed his conquest with satisfaction. The Zephyrian homeworld hung before him like a wounded animal, its cities burning, its defenses shattered. In just 36 hours, his forces had broken through their pathetic orbital stations, crushed their tiny fleet, and reduced their civilization to scattered groups hiding in underground bunkers. It had been almost embarrassingly easy. The Zephyrians had technology, certainly, but they had no military tradition, no warrior culture, no understanding of real violence. They had sent him surrender offers 6 different times, each more desperate than the last. Kresh had ignored them all. The Vorthan Empire didn't take prisoners or accept surrenders. They took what they wanted and eliminated what they didn't need. Status report, he commanded, his voice a harsh rasp that made his subordinates flinch. 97% of surface resistance eliminated, replied Commander Thek, his chief tactical officer. The remaining civilians have retreated to underground complexes. Our ground forces are in the process of locating and neutralizing them. How much longer? 8 hours, perhaps 10. The Zephyrians built their shelters deep, but we have seismic charges. We can collapse them from the surface. Kresh nodded approvingly. The Zephyrians would serve as an excellent example to other small civilizations that might think the Galactic Council could protect them. The galaxy needed to remember what real power looked like, and the Vorthans were happy to provide that lesson. Sir, interrupted Lieutenant Vex from the sensor station, I'm detecting multiple gravitational anomalies at the edge of the system. Looks like ships dropping out of hyperspace. Galactic Council? Kresh asked, though he wasn't particularly concerned. The Council's response forces were small, lightly armed, and bound by so many rules of engagement that they were practically useless in real combat. No, sir. These readings are unusual. The ships are larger than anything in Council registry. And there are a lot of them. Define a lot. 43 contacts, sir. And more arriving every minute. Kresh frowned. That was significantly larger than any Council force he had ever encountered. Put them on the main display. The holographic viewer at the center of the bridge flickered to life, showing the tactical situation at the edge of the Zephyr system. Vex was right. The ships were large, and they were definitely not Council designs. They had an aggressive, angular look that spoke of pure military purpose. No diplomatic modules, no research sections, no civilian accommodations. These were warships, and nothing else. Can you identify the species? Kresh asked. No, sir. The design architecture doesn't match anything in our databases. But they're transmitting on standard Council frequencies. Put it through. The communication came through in clear, unaccented galactic standard, spoken by a female voice that carried absolute authority. This is Admiral Catherine Morrison of the Human Defense Force 3rd Fleet. By order of the United Earth Government, you are commanded to immediately cease all hostile actions against the Zephyrian Republic. You have 1 hour to begin withdrawing your forces from Zephyr Prime and prepare to answer for violations of the Galactic Accords regarding warfare against civilian populations. Kresh stared at the display for a long moment. Humans. He had heard of them, though he had never encountered them directly. They were supposed to be a young species from somewhere on the galactic rim, barely a century into space travel. According to his intelligence files, they were primitive barbarians from a backwater world, notable only for their unusual aggression and their tendency to fight among themselves. Send a reply, he ordered. Tell these humans that the Vorthan Empire recognizes no authority over our military operations. Tell them to return to their own space before they find themselves in a conflict they cannot win. The response came back within minutes, and it wasn't what Kresh had expected. Admiral Morrison's compliments, the communication officer reported. She says, and I quote, "That's nice. You still have 57 minutes. Kresh felt his jaw clench. These humans were either very brave or very stupid. What's the tactical situation? How many ships do they have now? 61 contacts, sir. And they're moving into formation. They appear to be advancing toward Zephyr Prime. With 61 ships against our fleet of 300? They must be insane. Sir, Vex said hesitantly, I'm reading some unusual energy signatures from those ships. Power outputs are significantly higher than normal for vessels of their size. Show me detailed scans of their lead vessel. The tactical display zoomed in on the largest of the human ships, a massive dreadnought that dwarfed even Kresh's own flagship. The hull was a dark gray-black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Along its length, Kresh could see what appeared to be weapon ports, but the energy readings were unlike anything he had seen before. Estimated firepower, he asked. Unknown, sir. The weapons technology doesn't match any known patterns. But, based on power consumption alone, I would estimate that single ship could engage our entire fleet. Kresh laughed, though it was not a pleasant sound. Impossible. No single ship has that kind of firepower. These readings must be in error. Sir, should I order the fleet to intercept? Kresh considered his options. 300 ships against 61. Those were excellent odds, even if the human ships were more advanced than his intelligence suggested. And destroying a human fleet would send an even stronger message to the galaxy than wiping out the Zephyrians. Signal the fleet, he decided. All ships, combat formation. We will engage these humans and demonstrate what happens to those who interfere with the Vorthan Empire. Aboard the UES Retribution, Admiral Morrison watched the Vorthan fleet moving to intercept and felt a familiar calm settle over her. She had been in hundreds of battles over the years, from small skirmishes on the frontier to massive fleet engagements against the Centauri rebels. This feeling was always the same just before the shooting started. Time seemed to slow down, her mind became crystal clear, and every detail of the tactical situation locked into perfect focus. Status report, she ordered. All ships report ready for action, replied Captain Williams, her flight captain. The Vorthans have 300 ships moving to engage. Mixed classes, but primarily cruiser and destroyer equivalents. No dreadnought-class vessels detected. Weapons status? All batteries charged and ready. Missile tubes loaded. Point defense systems online. We're ready to engage on your order, Admiral. Morrison studied the tactical display. The Vorthans were moving in a classic enveloping formation, trying to use their numerical superiority to surround the human fleet and bring all their weapons to bear at once. It was good tactical thinking, if you were fighting an opponent who used conventional weapons and tactics.
Signal to all ships, Morrison said. Execute Protocol 7. Full spread, maximum intensity.
Ma'am, Williams said carefully, Protocol 7 is designed for use against hardened military targets. The Galactic Council might object to us using it against ships that have crews aboard. Morrison looked at him with steel in her eyes.
Captain, those crews just spent the last day and a half bombing hospitals and shooting children.
I'm not particularly concerned about their welfare at the moment.
Understood, ma'am. All ships, execute Protocol 7.
Across the human fleet, weapons systems that had been designed to fight wars against peer opponents came online. Humanity had entered the galactic community during a period of relative peace, and most species had assumed that their weapons technology was primitive compared to the established powers. This was a reasonable assumption, given that humans had only been in space for a few decades. What the galactic community hadn't realized was that humanity had spent those decades doing what humans did best, fighting wars. The Centauri border wars, the Martian independence campaign, the asteroid belt conflicts, and a dozen smaller military actions had driven human weapons technology forward at a pace that astounded other species. When you were fighting enemies who might have technological advantages, you learned to hit harder and faster than anyone expected. The human fleet's main weapons were gravitic lances, focused streams of artificial gravity that could tear apart matter at the subatomic level. Each of the heavy cruisers carried 8 of them. The destroyers mounted 4. And the Retribution, the fleet flagship, carried 16 of the massive weapons along with missile batteries loaded with antimatter warheads and point defense systems that could track and destroy thousands of incoming projectiles simultaneously.
Range to target? Morrison asked. Optimal firing distance in 30 seconds, reported the weapons officer.
All ships, prepare to fire. On Zephyr Prime, Ambassador Kellen and the other survivors felt the shelter shake as something massive passed overhead. The sound was different from the Vorthan war machines. Deeper, more powerful, with an underlying harmonic that seemed to vibrate through the very rock around them.
What's happening up there? Dr. Yeth asked.
Before anyone could answer, Technician Rels called out from his sensor station.
Ambassador! You need to see this.
Kellen hurried over to his display. The screen showed a tactical readout of local space, with dozens of icons representing ships in orbit around Zephyr Prime. The Vorthan fleet was there, moving in formation toward a smaller group of unknown vessels.
Those new ships, Kellen said, can you identify them?
I'm trying, but their technology is unlike anything I've seen before.
Wait.
Rels adjusted his controls, and, suddenly, the shelter's communication system crackled to life. "This is Admiral Catherine Morrison of the Human Defense Force," came a voice speaking clear galactic standard.
"We are responding to your distress call. All Zephyrian civilians should remain in secure locations while we deal with the hostile forces in your system. We will contact you directly once the immediate threat has been neutralized." Kellen stared at the speaker in shock. Humans? I've never heard of humans. Neither have I, Rels admitted. But they say they're here to help.
Dr. Yeth moved closer to the communication station.
How many ships do they have?
61 contacts at last count, Rels replied.
But the Vorthans have over 300.
A hush fell over the shelter as the implications sank in. Some unknown species had answered their call for help, but they were vastly outnumbered. It seemed that even this glimmer of hope was doomed to failure. In orbit, Admiral Morrison watched the Vorthan fleet approach and made her final calculations. Range was optimal, targeting solutions were locked in, and all ships reported ready to fire. "All ships," she commanded, "engage." The human fleet opened fire with a coordinated salvo that lit up space like a newborn star. 61 ships unleashed everything they had at once, sending hundreds of gravitic lance beams and thousands of missiles streaking toward the Vorthan fleet. The energy output was so intense that it temporarily overloaded sensors throughout the system. High Admiral Kresh had perhaps 3 seconds to realize that his intelligence about human capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. The weapons hitting his fleet weren't just advanced, they were from a completely different paradigm of warfare. Ships that should have taken minutes to destroy were being vaporized instantly. His formation wasn't just being disrupted, it was being annihilated. The dominant predator took 7 gravitic lance hits and simply ceased to exist, along with High Admiral Kresh and his entire crew. Around it, cruiser after cruiser was torn apart by weapons that turned matter into energy with perfect efficiency. The Vorthan return fire, such as it was, splashed harmlessly against human shields that had been designed to withstand the focused fury of artificial stars. In less than 10 minutes, 300 Vorthan ships had been reduced to expanding clouds of superheated plasma. The few vessels that survived the initial engagement immediately began broadcasting surrender signals, but the human fleet showed no signs of slowing down. In the underground shelter, the Zephyrians felt the vibrations stop as suddenly as they had begun.
Technician Rel stared at his instruments in disbelief. "Ambassador," he said slowly, "the Vorthan fleet is gone." "Gone where?" "Just gone. I'm not detecting any Vorthan ships in the system. At all." Kellen looked at the tactical display, which showed only the human fleet remaining in orbit. 61 ships had destroyed 300 in less time than it took to boil water. "What kind of species did we call for help?" she whispered. As if in answer to her question, Admiral Morrison's voice came through the communication system again, calm and professional. "This is Admiral Morrison to all Zephyrian survivors.
The immediate orbital threat has been neutralized.
We are now proceeding to eliminate remaining hostile forces on the surface. Please remain in secure locations until we can establish that the area is safe. Human ground forces will begin landing operations within the hour."
Kellen sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the rapid change in their situation. A few hours ago, her people had been facing extinction. Now, some unknown species had appeared and destroyed the entire Vorthan fleet as if it were nothing more than a training exercise.
"Ambassador," Dr. Yeth said quietly, "who are these humans? And what have we gotten ourselves into?"
The first thing that struck Major Elena Vasquez about Zephyr Prime was how beautiful it should have been. Even through the smoke and destruction, she could see the elegant crystal spires that the Zephyrians were famous for, growing from the landscape like frozen music. Gardens that had once been works of art now lay trampled under the treads of Vorthan war machines, their delicate plants crushed and their crystalline structures shattered into glittering fragments. The second thing that struck her was the smell. Death had a particular odor that every soldier learned to recognize, and it hung over the Zephyrian capital like a toxic cloud. Mixed with it were the scents of burning metal, melted plastic, and something else that her suit sensors identified as biological warfare agents.
"Contact ahead," reported Sergeant Chen through the tactical network. "Looks like a Vorthan patrol, 200 meters northwest of your position."
Vasquez signaled for her squad to take cover behind the ruins of what had once been a Zephyrian art museum. Through her helmet's enhanced optics, she could see the enemy patrol moving through the wreckage of the museum district. 6 Vorthans in powered armor, sweeping through the rubble with obvious intent to kill anything they found alive. The Vorthans were large by galactic standards, nearly 8 feet tall with thick, armored skin and powerful limbs that could crush bone without effort. Their natural weapons were formidable, and their technology was advanced enough to conquer most of the civilizations they encountered. They looked like apex predators, and they had ruled through fear for centuries. They had never encountered human soldiers before. "Squad leaders, this is Overwatch," came Admiral Morrison's voice through the command frequency.
"Rules of engagement are simple. Any Vorthan forces engaging in hostile action against civilians are to be terminated immediately. Any Vorthans attempting to surrender will be detained for war crimes trials.
Any Vorthans found to have participated in attacks on hospitals, schools, or civilian shelters are to be terminated regardless of surrender attempts."
"Questions?"
"No questions, Admiral," Vasquez replied.
"Crystal clear."
She switched to her squad frequency.
"You heard the Admiral.
These bastards have been shooting children for the last 2 days.
Let's return the favor." The engagement lasted exactly 47 seconds.
The Vorthans, despite their size and natural aggression, had never developed tactics for fighting an enemy that moved as fast and hit as hard as human soldiers. They were still trying to locate the source of the first shots when the last of them fell to the ground.
"Target eliminated," Vasquez reported. Continuing sweep pattern.
Across the planet, similar scenes played out as human ground forces methodically hunted down the remaining Vorthan troops. The invaders had expected to face frightened civilians and, perhaps a few poorly trained militia forces. Instead, they found themselves confronting soldiers who had learned their trade in some of the most brutal conflicts in galactic history.
Humanity's ground forces reflected the same aggressive philosophy as their space fleet.
Every soldier was equipped with powered armor that made them faster and stronger than most species' heavy assault troops. Their weapons were designed for maximum lethality, and their tactics emphasized speed, violence, and overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment. But it wasn't just their technology that made them formidable. Human soldiers had something that other species found difficult to understand. When they saw evidence of atrocities committed against civilians, they became something beyond mere professional warriors. They became instruments of vengeance, and they did not stop until every threat had been eliminated. In Underground Complex 7, Ambassador Kellen listened to the sounds of battle raging overhead. The deep vibrations had returned, along with new sounds that her translator couldn't identify. Energy weapons firing in rapid bursts, the crash of falling buildings, and, occasionally, very briefly, something that sounded almost like screaming. "How much longer do you think it will take?" asked Dr. Yeth nervously. Before Kellen could answer, the shelter's communication system activated again. This time, the voice was different. Younger, and speaking with an accent that their translator identified as Human Regional Variant 7. "Zephyrian survivors in Underground Complex 7, this is Major Elena Vasquez of the Human Defense Force. We're conducting clearing operations in your area. Please remain in secure locations until we can confirm that all hostile forces have been eliminated. We estimate approximately 2 more hours before your area will be completely safe." Technician Rells looked up from his instruments. "They know exactly where we are. How is that possible?" "Advanced sensors, probably," Kellen said. "But the fact that they're telling us to stay put suggests they don't consider us a threat." "Should we be worried about that?" Dr. Yeth asked. "I mean, we don't know anything about these humans. They could be just as dangerous as the Vorthons." Kellen considered the question. In the space of a few hours, these humans had destroyed an entire Vorthon fleet and were apparently making short work of the ground forces as well. They clearly had technology that was generations ahead of anything in the Galactic Council, and their military capabilities were beyond anything she had ever imagined. But they had answered a call for help. They had crossed, however, many light-years of space to respond to the plea of a species they had apparently never heard of before. And they were taking the time to let the survivors know what was happening instead of simply ignoring them. "I don't think so," she said finally. "They could have just ignored our distress call. They could have demanded payment or territorial concessions before helping us. They could have waited for the Galactic Council to handle the situation through proper channels. Instead, they came here and started shooting Vorthons. That suggests their intentions are good. Or that they have some agenda we don't understand yet," Dr. Yeth pointed out. "Maybe. But, right now, they're killing the people who were trying to kill us. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt." 2 levels above them, Major Vasquez and her squad were moving through the administrative district, checking each building for survivors and making sure no Vorthon forces had escaped the initial sweep. Her suit's sensors were picking up life signs from the underground complexes, but her orders were to secure the surface first. "Major," called Corporal Johnson from his position near what had been the planetary government building. "You need to see this." Vasquez moved to his location and looked at what had gotten his attention. It was a Zephyrian hospital, or what was left of one. The building had taken multiple direct hits from heavy weapons, and the medical symbol on the roof had been deliberately targeted. Bodies were scattered around the entrance, and, from their positioning, it looked like they had been trying to evacuate patients when the attack came. "Bastards," Johnson muttered. They were shooting people on stretchers. Vasquez felt the familiar cold anger settle over her. She had seen similar atrocities during the border wars, when enemy forces decided that the rules of war didn't apply to them. It never got easier to witness, and it never failed to make her furious. "Contact the Admiral," she ordered. "Tell her we have confirmation of deliberate attacks on medical facilities. Make sure she knows the Vorthons were targeting wounded civilians." "Copy that. Should I also mention the school we found 3 blocks back?" "Yeah. Make sure she gets the full picture." In orbit aboard the UES Retribution, Admiral Morrison received the reports from ground forces with growing anger. It was one thing to conquer a planet through military action. It was quite another to deliberately target hospitals and schools, to use biological weapons against civilians, to shoot wounded people who were trying to evacuate medical facilities. "Admiral," Captain Williams said carefully, "the surviving Vorthon ships are requesting permission to retrieve their ground forces and withdraw from the system." Morrison looked at the tactical display, which showed the dozen or so Vorthan vessels that had managed to survive the initial engagement. They were maintaining position at the edge of the system, well out of weapons range, and broadcasting continuous surrender signals. "Tell them no," she said flatly.
"Ma'am?"
"Tell them that any Vorthan forces remaining in this system are now considered war criminals.
They will surrender unconditionally and submit to justice, or they will be destroyed. They don't get to retreat after what they've done here."
"Admiral, the Galactic Council protocols regarding military surrenders specifically state Captain," Morrison interrupted, her voice cold enough to freeze hydrogen. "I've seen the reports from our ground teams.
These people bombed hospitals. They shot children. They used biological weapons against a civilian population that never posed any threat to them. As far as I'm concerned, they've forfeited any right to consideration under the Galactic Accords." Williams nodded slowly. "Understood, ma'am. What if they refuse to surrender?
Then, we'll add their ships to the debris field we've already created."
Back on Zephyr Prime, the sounds of battle were beginning to diminish.
Major Vasquez and her teams had methodically cleared sector after sector, eliminating the remaining Vorthan forces with the kind of thorough efficiency that had made human soldiers feared throughout the frontier regions of their own space. The Vorthans, for all their natural advantages, had proven surprisingly vulnerable to human tactics. They were used to fighting opponents who shared their concepts of honorable combat, who engaged in formal battle lines and followed predictable patterns. Human soldiers fought like their ancestors had learned to fight on the Deathworld that had spawned them. They used every advantage available, struck from unexpected directions, and showed no mercy to enemies who had demonstrated they deserved none. "All sector commanders, this is Overwatch," came Admiral Morrison's voice through the command net.
"Ground operations are complete. All hostile forces have been eliminated or captured. Begin transition to humanitarian assistance operations. Medical teams are inbound from the fleet."
Vasquez felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The killing was over, at least for now. Now came the harder part, helping the survivors pick up the pieces and trying to undo as much of the damage as possible.
"Squad leaders, switch to humanitarian protocols," she ordered.
"Let's go find some survivors and let them know it's safe to come out."
In Underground Complex 7, the silence was almost as frightening as the battle sounds had been.
For several minutes, nothing could be heard except the hum of failing life support systems and the quiet murmur of frightened voices. Then, the communication system activated one final time.
"Zephyrian survivors in Underground Complex 7, this is Major Elena Vasquez. The area has been secured. All hostile forces have been eliminated. You are now safe to emerge from the shelters.
Human medical teams are standing by to provide assistance to anyone who needs it."
Ambassador Kellen looked around at the faces of her people.
300 civilians who had spent the last 2 days waiting to die. Children who had huddled in the darkness while monsters prowled above them.
Families who had lost everything except their lives. "Should we go up?" asked Dr. Yeth.
Kellen made her decision.
"Yes. These humans answered our call for help. They risked their lives to save people they'd never met. The least we can do is say thank you."
The trip to the surface took nearly an hour. The shelter's elevators had been damaged in the bombing, and they had to use emergency stairways that had partially collapsed. But, eventually, 300 Zephyrians emerged into the daylight of their homeworld for the first time in 2 days. What they saw was devastation beyond anything they had imagined.
Their capital city was in ruins, their crystal spires shattered, their gardens destroyed.
But, standing among the wreckage were figures in dark armor, humans who had traveled across the galaxy to answer the desperate plea of a species they had never heard of.
Major Vasquez was waiting for them as they emerged from the complex.
She had removed her helmet, revealing a face that was younger than Kellen had expected, with short dark hair and eyes that had seen too much violence but still held compassion for those who had suffered. "Ambassador Kellen," she asked, and Kellen was surprised that the translator made her voice sound almost musical.
"Yes. You're Major Vasquez?"
"That's right. On behalf of the Human Defense Force and the United Earth Government, please accept our condolences for your losses and our apologies that we couldn't arrive sooner."
Kellen stared at the human officer. "An apology?"
These people had crossed unknown distances, destroyed an entire invasion fleet, and eliminated every enemy soldier on the planet, and they were apologizing for not arriving sooner. Major, she said carefully, I don't think we can ever adequately thank you for what you've done. Our entire species owes you a debt we can never repay.
Vasquez looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, no debt is necessary. Someone sent out a call for help. We answered it.
That's what civilized people do. As if to emphasize her point, the sky above them filled with the shapes of incoming human shuttles, loaded with medical supplies, food, emergency shelter equipment, and everything else that would be needed to help the Zephyrian survivors begin rebuilding their lives.
Kellen watched the shuttles land and felt something that she had thought was lost forever. Hope. Not just for survival, but for something more.
These humans had demonstrated something that the galaxy had thought was extinct, the willingness of one species to risk everything for another, without asking for anything in return.
Major, she said, would it be possible for me to speak with your admiral? There are things about the galaxy that I think your people should know.
Vasquez smiled, and, for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Kellen felt like everything might actually be all right.
I think that can be arranged, the human officer said. But, first, let's get your people taken care of. The talking can wait until everyone's safe and fed.
As human medical teams began moving among the Zephyrian survivors, setting up treatment stations and distributing emergency supplies, Kellen realized that their call for help had brought them more than just rescue. It had brought them first contact with a species that might change everything about how the galaxy understood itself. She just hoped that the galaxy was ready for it. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened exactly 72 hours after the first reports of human military action reached Centauri Station. Council Chamber Alpha, normally a place of measured debate and careful diplomacy, buzzed with an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty that had not been present in over 2 centuries. High Counselor THYSS of the Altruian Republic called the session to order with visible reluctance. As the longest-serving member of the Council and representative of one of the founding species, she had hoped never to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. The delicate balance of galactic civilization, maintained through careful negotiation and mutual cooperation, had been shattered by a species that most council members had barely heard of until 3 days ago. Fellow councilors, she began, her melodic voice carrying clearly through the chamber's advanced acoustics, we are here to address the unprecedented military action taken by the species known as humans in the Zephyr system. As you all know, a human fleet numbering 61 vessels entered the system without authorization and engaged Vorthan Empire forces in what can only be described as a massacre. Councillor Vorth of the Centauri Federation, a tall, blue-skinned humanoid with silver hair, stood to address the chamber. High Counselor, while we all appreciate the gravity of the situation, let us not forget that the Vorthans were in clear violation of the Galactic Accords. They attacked a peaceful member species without provocation and used biological weapons against civilian populations. Perhaps massacre is not the appropriate term for stopping such atrocities. A wave of murmurs swept through the chamber. The Centaurians had a history of military conflict with some of the more aggressive species, and they understood better than most what real warfare looked like. They were also, several counselors noted privately, the species most likely to appreciate human military efficiency. Nevertheless, interjected Councillor Breen of the Vorthan Empire, his voice filled with barely controlled rage, the humans completely destroyed 300 vessels of the Imperial fleet without warning, without negotiation, and without regard for the laws of war that have governed civilized conflict for millennia. This is not peacekeeping. This is naked aggression. High Counselor THYSS looked at the Vorthan representative with poorly concealed distaste. Councillor Breen, your Empire's forces were documented using biological weapons against a civilian population. They bombed hospitals and schools. They were in the process of committing genocide when human forces arrived. Perhaps you should consider what that suggests about your Empire's commitment to civilized behavior. The Zephyrians were harboring terrorists, Breen replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Our actions were within the bounds of legitimate military response to insurrection. The Zephyrians have never had a military force capable of threatening anyone, said Councillor Yith of the Rigelian Consortium. Your terrorists were artists and farmers who had never harmed another living being. Your forces were systematically exterminating a peaceful population, and everyone in this chamber knows it. The debate might have continued for hours, following the usual patterns of diplomatic maneuvering and face-saving rhetoric. But it was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected participant. High Counselor, announced the Chamber's protocol officer, we have received a request to address the Council from Admiral Catherine Morrison of the Human Defense Force. A hush fell over the chamber. In the 500 years of the Galactic Council's existence, no military officer had ever addressed the full assembly during an emergency session. Military matters were handled through proper diplomatic channels, with carefully worded statements and formal protocols. This is highly irregular, Councillor Breen protested. Military personnel do not address the Council directly. Perhaps, said High Councillor THYSS, but, given the unprecedented nature of recent events, I think we should hear what Admiral Morrison has to say. Does the Council agree? The vote was closer than many expected, but the motion carried. Within minutes, the chamber's holographic projectors activated, and the figure of Admiral Morrison appeared at the center of the assembly. She was a tall woman in her 60s, wearing the dark blue uniform of the Human Defense Force, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. She looked around the chamber with calm interest, as if she were evaluating potential threats rather than addressing the galactic government. Honorable councillors, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets in combat. I am Admiral Catherine Morrison, commanding officer of the Human Defense Force 3rd Fleet. I am here to clarify the recent events in the Zephyr system and to make our position clear to this assembly. High Councillor THYSS found herself leaning forward slightly. There was something about this human that commanded attention, a presence that filled the chamber despite her being only a holographic projection. Admiral Morrison, THYSS said carefully, the Council appreciates your willingness to address us directly. However, we must note that human forces entered the Zephyr system without authorization and engaged in military action without Council approval. This represents a serious violation of galactic law. Morrison's expression didn't change. High Councillor, with respect, we received a distress call from a member species requesting immediate assistance. Our analysis indicated that waiting for Council approval would have resulted in the complete extermination of the Zephyrian population. We acted to prevent genocide. But, the proper channels began Councillor Breen. The proper channels, Morrison interrupted, her voice taking on an edge that made several councillors uncomfortable, would have taken a week to authorize a response. In a week, every Zephyrian would have been dead. Are you suggesting that we should have allowed that to happen in order to maintain proper procedures? The chamber fell silent. It was a question that cut to the heart of the Council's greatest weakness. Their careful deliberation and respect for proper process had prevented many conflicts, but it had also made them slow to respond to genuine emergencies. Admiral, said Councillor Vorth, while we appreciate the humanitarian nature of your intervention, the scale of force employed was unprecedented. 300 ships destroyed in less than 10 minutes represents a level of military capability that concerns many in this chamber. Morrison nodded. I understand your concern, Councillor. But, I would point out that those 300 ships were engaged in the systematic murder of a civilian population. The level of force we employed was appropriate to the threat they represented. And, what happens now? Asked Councillor Yith. Your fleet remains in the Zephyr system. Your forces are occupying a sovereign world. What are human intentions regarding the region? Our intention, Morrison replied, is to ensure that the Zephyrian people can rebuild their civilization without fear of further attack. We will maintain a presence in the system until they are able to defend themselves, or until the Council can provide adequate protection. We have no territorial ambitions beyond that. High Councillor THYSS studied the human admiral's face. Admiral Morrison, you must understand that your actions, however well-intentioned, have destabilized the careful balance of power that has maintained galactic peace for centuries. Other species now know that humanity possesses military capabilities far beyond what anyone realized. This will inevitably lead to an arms race that could threaten the peace we have all worked to maintain. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and, when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the entire chamber listen. High Councillor, for the last 3 days, my forces have been working to help the Zephyrian survivors rebuild their lives. We've distributed food and medical supplies, restored power to their cities, and helped them bury their dead. In the process, we've learned exactly what the Vorthan Empire did to these people. She paused, and the chamber's attention focused on her with laser intensity. They didn't just attack military targets or strategic installations. They systematically targeted hospitals, schools, and civilian shelters. They used biological weapons designed to cause maximum suffering before death. They shot wounded civilians who were trying to evacuate medical facilities. They bombed refugee centers full of children. Morrison's voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it that made several councillors shift uncomfortably in their seats. When human forces arrived, we found evidence that the Vorthons were planning to use the surviving civilian population for biological experimentation. They had already separated children from their parents and were transporting them to processing facilities. A collective intake of breath swept through the chamber. Even by the standards of the most aggressive species in the galaxy, using sentient beings for biological experimentation was considered beyond acceptable behavior. So when you ask me about destabilizing the balance of power, Morrison continued, I want you to understand something about humanity. We don't care about the balance of power. We care about preventing atrocities like this from happening again. And if that makes other species uncomfortable, then perhaps those species should examine their own priorities.
Counselor Breen rose angrily.
Admiral, you cannot simply ignore centuries of established law and custom because you disapprove of the actions of a few rogue elements within the Imperial forces. Morrison turned to look directly at the Vorthon representative, and her expression became glacial. Counselor Breen, according to our analysis of captured communications, the attack on Zephyr Prime was ordered directly by your Imperial High Command. The use of biological weapons was approved at the highest levels of your government.
The targeting of civilians was deliberate policy, not the action of rogue elements. She paused, letting that sink in.
Furthermore, our intelligence indicates that this was not an isolated incident. The Vorthon Empire has conducted similar campaigns against at least 6 other species over the last 50 years, all of which were covered up or ignored by this council. The chamber erupted in shocked voices and angry denials. High Counselor THYSS called for order several times before quiet was restored. Admiral Morrison, THYSS said when she could make herself heard, these are serious allegations.
Do you have evidence to support them?
We do. All captured Vorthon personnel and data cores have been transferred to neutral territory and are available for independent examination. I believe the Rigelian Consortium has already agreed to provide forensic analysis.
Counselor Yith nodded confirmation. The evidence Admiral Morrison refers to is extensive and appears authentic.
The Vorthon Empire has indeed conducted systematic campaigns of extermination against multiple species. The Council was either deceived about the nature of these conflicts or chose not to investigate them properly.
Counselor Breen's face had gone pale.
These allegations are fabricated. Human propaganda designed to justify their illegal military action. The evidence includes biological samples of the weapons used, Morrison said calmly. Genetic markers that can be traced to Vorthon biowarfare programs, communication logs detailing the planning of civilian targets, and testimony from captured officers who believed they were following legitimate orders. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every counselor who would look at her. Honorable counselors, humanity is new to galactic civilization, but we are not naive about how power works. We understand that you maintain peace through careful balance and mutual cooperation. But we also understand that some beings will take advantage of that system to commit acts of unspeakable evil, secure in the knowledge that proper procedures will prevent anyone from stopping them.
High Counselor THYSS felt a chill run down her spine. What are you saying, Admiral?
I'm saying that humanity will not allow genocide to occur while bureaucrats debate proper procedures. If that puts us at odds with this council, then so be it. We would rather be outlaws who prevent atrocities than law-abiding citizens who stand by and watch them happen.
The chamber fell silent as the implications of Morrison's words sank in. Humanity was essentially declaring that they would act unilaterally to prevent what they considered atrocities, regardless of galactic law or council authority.
Admiral, said Counselor Vorth carefully, surely you understand that such a position is unsustainable.
If every species decides to act unilaterally based on their own moral judgments, galactic civilization will collapse into chaos.
Morrison nodded. That's true, Counselor. Which is why we are prepared to work with the Council to establish new protocols for responding to humanitarian crises.
But those protocols must include provisions for immediate action when lives are at stake. We will not allow perfect to become the enemy of good.
And if the Council refuses, asked High Counselor THYSS, though she feared she already knew the answer. Then, humanity will establish its own protocols, Morrison replied. We will form alliances with species who share our values, and we will act to protect innocent lives wherever they are threatened. We hope that won't be necessary, but we are prepared for that possibility. The chamber was quiet for several minutes as the counselors absorbed the magnitude of what they were being told. Humanity was essentially offering the Council a choice: reform to allow rapid response to humanitarian crises, or watch as humanity created an alternative power structure that could potentially replace the Council entirely.
Admiral Morrison, High Counselor THYSS said finally, "You are asking us to fundamentally alter the way galactic civilization has operated for centuries."
Yes, Morrison replied simply. Because the way it has operated for centuries allowed the Vorthans to commit genocide while everyone followed proper procedures. That's not acceptable to humanity, and it shouldn't be acceptable to anyone else. She paused, and, when she continued, her voice carried a note of hope that hadn't been present before.
"But, I want to be clear about something. Humanity doesn't want to replace the Council or dominate galactic civilization.
We want to work with you to create a system that can respond effectively to prevent atrocities while maintaining the peace you've worked so hard to build. We believe that's possible, if we're all willing to admit that the current system has flaws that need to be addressed." High Counselor THYSS looked around the chamber, seeing her own thoughts reflected in the faces of her fellow counselors. The arrival of humanity had indeed destabilized the galactic balance of power, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Perhaps it was time to examine whether their careful procedures had become more important than the lives they were meant to protect. "Admiral Morrison," she said, "I believe this council needs to have extensive discussions about the issues you've raised.
Would humanity be willing to participate in a working group to develop new emergency response protocols?"
"We would be honored to participate," Morrison replied.
"But, I want to be clear about our timeline. The working group has 6 months to develop workable protocols.
If we don't see meaningful progress by then, humanity will proceed with our own plans."
"That seems reasonable," THYSS said, though she was already dreading the political challenges that lay ahead. "Is there anything else you wish to address?"
Morrison smiled for the first time since the session began, and it transformed her entire appearance from threatening military commander to simply a woman who cared deeply about protecting innocent lives. "Just this, High Counselor. 3 days ago, a small species called for help, and humanity answered. We didn't ask what they could offer us in return, or whether helping them was politically advantageous. We came because it was the right thing to do. That's who we are, and that's who we will always be. The galaxy can choose to work with us or against us, but it cannot choose to ignore us." The holographic projection faded, leaving the council chamber in profound silence.
Finally, High Counselor THYSS spoke.
"I believe, fellow counselors, that the galaxy has just changed in ways we're only beginning to understand." 6 months after the Battle of Zephyr Prime, Ambassador Kellen stood in the newly reconstructed Great Hall of her homeworld's capital, watching delegates from across the galaxy arrive for what historians would later call the most important diplomatic gathering since the founding of the Galactic Council itself. The building around her was a masterpiece of cooperative engineering, combining traditional Zephyrian crystal architecture with human structural techniques and Altrian healing gardens. It was beautiful, functional, and symbolic of something entirely new in galactic civilization. The hall itself buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages as representatives from over 200 species gathered to witness the signing of the humanitarian response accords. Some came as supporters of the new protocols, others as skeptics or opponents, but all came with the understanding that they were present at a turning point in galactic history.
Kellen adjusted her formal robes and checked her chronometer.
In 30 minutes, she would address the assembly as the primary sponsor of the accords that bore her world's name. The Zephyr Protocols, as they had come to be known, represented 6 months of intense negotiation, compromise, and occasionally heated debate between humanity and the established powers of the galaxy. "Nervous?" asked a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see Major Elena Vasquez, now promoted to colonel and serving as humanity's military liaison to the Zephyrian government. The human officer was dressed in formal diplomatic attire rather than her usual combat gear, but she still carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had seen battle and emerged victorious. Terrified, Kellen admitted. "In 30 minutes, I'll be speaking to representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. 6 months ago, most of them had never heard of my people.
Now I'm supposed to convince them to fundamentally change how they respond to humanitarian crises." Vasquez smiled. "You'll be fine. Remember, you're not asking them to do anything they shouldn't want to do anyway.
You're just asking them to do it faster and more effectively."
"Is Admiral Morrison here yet?" Kellen asked. "She arrived an hour ago."
"She's in conference room 7 with the council leadership, making sure everyone understands exactly what humanity expects from these accords."
Kellen had come to know Admiral Morrison well over the past 6 months.
The human commander had spent almost as much time on Zephyr Prime as in space, personally overseeing the reconstruction efforts and working closely with Zephyrian leaders to develop the new protocols. She was nothing like the stereotypical image of human military officers that had circulated through galactic intelligence networks. She was thoughtful, compassionate, and deeply committed to preventing other civilizations from suffering what the Zephyrians had endured. She was also, Kellen had learned, utterly inflexible when it came to protecting innocent lives.
"How do you think the vote will go?" Kellen asked. Vasquez considered the question.
"The Altruians, Rigelians, and Centaurians are solid supporters.
The Andromedans and the Tau Ceti Federation are leaning in favor.
The real question is whether we can get enough of the mid-tier powers to support us.
If we can get a 2/3 majority, even the holdouts will have to go along." "And the Vorthans?" "The Vorthan Empire's representative walked out of the preliminary hearings 3 days ago," Vasquez said with satisfaction. "After the evidence of their war crimes was presented, they've been politically isolated. Most species don't want to be associated with systematic genocide, even by alliance." That was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the last 6 months from Kellen's perspective.
The Vorthan Empire, which had seemed so powerful and threatening, had been reduced to a pariah state. The evidence gathered by human forces had been exhaustive and damning, revealing not just the atrocities committed on Zephyr Prime but a decades-long pattern of systematic extermination campaigns against smaller civilizations. Species that had supposedly died from disease or natural disasters were revealed to have been murdered by Vorthan bioweapons. The political fallout had been swift and devastating. Trade relationships had been severed, diplomatic ties cut, and several former Vorthan client states had declared independence. The empire still existed, but it was isolated, weakened, and facing internal rebellions from subject species who now knew the truth about their conquerors.
5 minutes to opening ceremonies, announced the hall's protocol officer. Kellen took a deep breath and walked toward the main podium.
As she moved through the crowd, she caught glimpses of conversations that would have been impossible just 6 months earlier.
Human naval officers were discussing joint training exercises with Centaurian fleet commanders. Altruian medical teams were comparing notes with human field medics about trauma treatment techniques. Representatives from a dozen minor civilizations were forming a mutual defense alliance with humanity as the primary guarantor. The galaxy was changing, and not everyone was happy about it.
At the high table reserved for council leadership, High Counselor THYSS reviewed her notes one final time.
The last 6 months had been the most challenging of her long political career.
The working group sessions had been contentious, with some species arguing that humanity's demands would militarize galactic civilization and others insisting that the current system's failures demanded radical reform. The compromise they had finally reached was elegant in its simplicity but revolutionary in its implications. The Zephyr protocols established a new category of galactic law, humanitarian emergency response. When evidence of genocide, mass enslavement, or systematic atrocities was presented to an emergency response committee, that committee could authorize immediate military intervention by member species without requiring full council debate. The committee would consist of rotating members from major civilizations, with humanity holding a permanent seat in recognition of their military capabilities and their role in developing the protocols. Response forces would be contributed by volunteer member species, with command authority determined by the scale and nature of the threat. Most importantly, the protocols included provisions for preventive action. Species engaging in activities that appeared to be precursors to atrocities could be subject to investigation, sanctions, and ultimately preemptive intervention if they refused to modify their behavior. It was exactly the kind of rapid response capability that could have prevented the near extinction of the Zephyrians, and it represented a fundamental shift in how galactic civilization understood its moral obligations. Council members, distinguished delegates, THYSS announced as she called the session to order, we gather today to address one of the most significant challenges facing our galactic community, how to respond effectively to humanitarian crises while maintaining the peace and stability that our institutions have preserved for centuries. She paused, looking out at the assembled representatives. The events on Zephyr Prime 6 months ago demonstrated both the worst and the best of our galactic civilization. We witnessed the systematic attempt to exterminate a peaceful species by an empire that had perverted the principles of civilized conduct. But we also witnessed the courage of a species that answered a call for help from beings they had never met, risking their own lives to protect innocents who had no claim on their assistance. Applause broke out across the hall, though Kellen noticed that not all delegates participated. Today, we have the opportunity to ensure that such atrocities never occur again, while also recognizing the new realities of galactic power and responsibility. I call upon Ambassador Kellen of the Zephyrian Republic to present the Humanitarian Response Accords for the consideration of this assembly. Kellen rose and walked to the central podium, her heart pounding. Behind her, the great crystal screen displayed images from the reconstruction of Zephyr Prime, cities being rebuilt, children playing in newly planted gardens, families reunited in refugee centers. The visual reminder of what they were trying to prevent was powerful and intentional. Honored delegates, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustics. 6 months ago, my people faced extinction. We sent out a desperate call for help, not knowing if anyone would hear us or if anyone would care enough to respond. We were, by any measure, insignificant in the grand scale of galactic civilization. We had no great wealth, no strategic resources, no political influence. We were simply a small people who wanted to live in peace. The hall was completely silent. When the Vorthan Empire attacked us, we had nowhere to turn. The established mechanisms for galactic security would have taken weeks to respond, and we had only hours. We were prepared to die, forgotten and alone, just another minor civilization that had failed to find its place in the galaxy. Kellen paused, gathering her strength for what came next. But humanity answered our call. Not because they expected anything in return, not because we had some strategic value, not because it was politically advantageous. They came because it was right. Because when innocents are threatened, civilized beings have an obligation to act. She gestured toward the human delegation, where Admiral Morrison sat with her characteristic calm expression. The humans who saved my people did not do so as part of some calculated political maneuver. They did so because they believe that all sentient life has value, and that those with the power to protect the innocent have a moral obligation to use that power. Applause began slowly but built to a crescendo that lasted several minutes. The Humanitarian Response Accords before you today embody that principle, Kellen continued when quiet returned. They establish clear procedures for rapid response to humanitarian crises, while maintaining the diplomatic safeguards that protect all our civilizations from arbitrary military action. They create a system that can act quickly to prevent atrocities, while ensuring that such action is accountable, proportionate, and subject to review. She looked around the hall, making eye contact with as many delegates as possible. More importantly, these accords represent a commitment by galactic civilization to the principle that some things are more important than political convenience. That some violations of civilized conduct are so fundamental that they require immediate action, regardless of diplomatic complications. The applause this time was more measured, as delegates considered the implications of what she was proposing. I know that some of you have concerns about these protocols. You worry that they will lead to military adventurism, that they will destabilize the careful balance of power that has maintained galactic peace. I understand those concerns, and I share them. Kellen paused, choosing her words carefully. But I ask you to consider the alternative. Under the current system, the Vorthan Empire was able to conduct systematic extermination campaigns against multiple species for decades, secure in the knowledge that proper procedures would prevent anyone from stopping them quickly enough to make a difference. That is not peace. That is simply the absence of visible conflict, maintained at the cost of countless innocent lives. The hall stirred as delegates whispered among themselves. The Humanitarian Response Accords offer a different approach. They maintain the Council's role as the primary diplomatic institution of galactic civilization, while creating mechanisms for rapid response when diplomacy alone is insufficient. They preserve the sovereignty of member species while establishing clear limits on behavior that threatens innocent life. Admiral Morrison rose from her seat in the human delegation and approached the podium. Kellen stepped aside, allowing the human commander to address the assembly. Honorable delegates, Morrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets in battle. Ambassador Kellen has spoken eloquently about the moral foundations of these accords. I want to address the practical concerns that many of you have raised. She activated the hall's holographic display, showing a tactical map of known space. Humanity has no interest in becoming the galaxy's police force. We do not want to impose our values on other civilizations, and we do not want to interfere in legitimate conflicts between sovereign species. What we want is a system that can respond effectively when civilized norms are violated so egregiously that intervention becomes a moral imperative. The map changed, highlighting several systems. The evidence we gathered about Vorthan activities revealed systematic atrocities against 13 different species over the last century.
Billions of sentient beings died while galactic civilization debated proper procedures.
That is not acceptable to humanity, and it should not be acceptable to any civilized species. Morrison looked around the hall, her expression serious but not threatening.
The protocols before you today include multiple safeguards against abuse. Military action can only be